Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 6 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Henry Charles LEA, Book 1, Chapter 3, The Jews and the Conversos, Part 6. The sacrifices entailed on the exiles were enormous. To realize in so limited a time, on every species of property not portable, with means of transportation so imperfect, was almost impossible, and in a forced sale of such magnitude the purchasers had a vast advantage, of which they fully availed themselves. An eyewitness tells us that the Christians bought their property for a trifle. They went around and found few buyers, so that they were compelled to give a house for an ass and a vineyard for a little cloth or linen. In some places the miserable wretches, unable to get any price, burnt their homes, and the aljamas bestowed the communal property on the cities. Their synagogues they were not allowed to sell, the Christians taking them and converting them into churches wherein to worship a God of justice and love. The cemeteries, for which they felt peculiar solicitude, were in many places made over to the cities, on condition of preservation from desecration and use only for pasturage. Where this was not done they were confiscated, and Torquemada obtained a fragment of the spoil by securing, March 23, 1494, from Ferdinand and Isabella, the grant of that of Avila for his convent of Santo Tomas. The resolute constancy displayed in this extremity was admirable. There were comparatively few renegades, and if Abraham Senior was one of them, it is urged in extenuation that Isabella, who was loath to lose his services, threatened, if he persisted in his faith, to adopt still sharper measures against his people, and he, knowing her capacity in this direction, submitted to baptism. He and his family had for godparents the sovereigns and Cardinal Gonzalez de Mendoza. They assumed the name of Coronel, which long remained distinguished. The frailes exerted themselves everywhere in preaching, but the converts were few and only of the lowest class. The Inquisition had changed the situation, and San Vicente Ferrer himself would have found missionary work unfruitful, for the dread of exile was less than that of the Holy Office and the quemadero. There was boundless mutual helpfulness. The rich aided the poor, and they made ready as best they could to face the perils of the unknown future. Before starting, all the boys and girls over 12 were married. Early in July the exodus commenced, and no better idea of this pilgrimage of grief can be conveyed than by the simple narrative of the good cura of Palacios. Disregarding, he says, the wealth they left behind, and confiding in the blind hope that God would lead them to the promised land, they left their homes, great and small, old and young, on foot, on horseback, on asses or other beasts, or in wagons, some falling, others rising, some dying, others being born, others falling sick. There was no Christian who did not pity them. Everywhere they were invited to conversion, and some were baptized, but very few, for the rabbis encouraged them and made the women and children play on the timbrel. Those who went to Cadiz hoped that God would open a path for them across the sea, but they stayed there many days, suffering much, and many wished that they had never been born. From Aragon and Catalonia they put to sea for Italy or the Moorish lands, or whithersoever fortune might drive them. Most of them had evil fate, robbery and murder by sea and in the lands of their refuge. This is shown by the fate of those who sailed from Cadiz. They had to embark in 25 ships, of which the captain was Pero Cabron. They sailed for Oran, where they found the corsair Fragoso and his fleet. They promised him 10,000 ducats not to molest them, to which he agreed, but night came on and they sailed for Arcilla, a Spanish settlement in Morocco, where a tempest scattered them. 16 ships put into Cartagena, where 150 souls landed and asked for baptism. Then the fleet went to Malaga, where 400 more did the same. The rest reached Arcilla and went to Fez. Multitudes also sailed from Gibraltar to Arcilla, whence they set out for Fez, under guard of Moors hired for the purpose, but they were robbed on the journey and their wives and daughters were violated. Many returned to Arcilla, where the new arrivals, on hearing of this, remained, forming a large camp. Then they divided into 2 parties, one persisting in going to Fez, the other preferring baptism at Arcilla, where the commandant, the Count of Boron, treated them kindly, and the priests baptized them in squads with sprinklers. The Count sent them back to Spain, and up to 1496 they were returning for baptism. In Palacios, Bernaldez baptized as many as 100, some of them being rabbis. Those who reached Fez were naked and starving and lousy. The king, seeing them a burden, permitted them to return, and they straggled back to Arcilla, robbed and murdered on the road, the women violated, and the men often cut open in search of gold thought to be concealed in their stomachs. Those who remained in Fez built a great Jewry for themselves, of houses of straw. One night it took fire, burning all their property and 50 or 100 souls, after which came a pestilence, carrying off more than 4,000. Ferdinand and Isabella, seeing that all who could get back returned for baptism, set guards to keep them out unless they had money to support themselves. The whole world was pitiless to these wretched outcasts, against whom every man's hand was raised. Those who sought Portugal utilized the 6 months allotted to them by sending a party to Fez to arrange for transit there. Many went and formed part of the luckless band whose misfortunes we have seen. Others remained, the richer paying the king 100 cruzados per household, the poorer 8 cruzados a head, while 1,000 who could pay nothing were enslaved. These King Manuel emancipated on his accession in 1495, but in 1497 he enforced conversion on all. Then, in Lisbon at Easter 1506, a new Christian in a Dominican church chanced to express a doubt as to a miraculous crucifix, when he was dragged out by the hair and slain. The Dominicans harangued the mob, parading the streets with the crucifix and exciting popular passion till a massacre ensued, in which the most revolting cruelties were perpetrated. It raged for 3 days, and ended only when no more victims could be found, the number of slain being estimated at several thousand. The further fate of these refugees we shall have occasion to trace hereafter. In Navarre, where the exiles had been kindly received, the era of toleration was brief. In 1498 an edict, based on that of Ferdinand and Isabella, gave them the alternative of baptism or expulsion, and at the same time such difficulties were thrown in the way of exile that they mostly submitted to baptism and remained a discredited class, subjected to numerous disabilities. Naples, whither numbers flocked, afforded an inhospitable refuge. In August 1492 9 caravels arrived there, loaded with Jews and infected with pestilence, which they communicated to the city, whence it spread through the kingdom and raged for a year, causing a mortality of 20,000. Then, in the confusion following the invasion of Charles LEA in 1495, the people rose against them. Many abandoned their religion to escape slaughter or slavery. Many were carried off to distant lands and sold as slaves. This tribulation lasted for 3 years, during which those who were steadfast in the faith were imprisoned or burnt or exposed to the caprices of the mob. Turkey, on the whole, proved the most satisfactory refuge, where Bajazet found them such profitable subjects that he ridiculed the wisdom popularly ascribed to the Spanish sovereigns who could commit so great an act of folly. Though exposed to occasional persecution, they continued to flourish. Most of the existing Jews of Turkey in Europe, and a large portion of those of Turkey in Asia, are descendants of the exiles. They absorbed the older communities, and their language is still the Spanish of the 16th century. When the fate of the exiles was, for the most part, so unendurable, it was natural that many should seek to return to their native land, and, as we have seen from Bernaldez, large numbers did so. At first this was tacitly permitted, on condition of conversion, provided they brought money with them. But the sovereigns finally grew fearful that the purity of the faith would be impaired, and in 1499 an explanatory edict was issued, decreeing death and confiscation for any Jew entering Spain, whether a foreigner or returning exile, even if he asked for baptism, unless beforehand he sent word that he wished to come for that purpose, when he was to be baptized at the port of entry, and a notarial act was to be taken. That this savage edict was pitilessly enforced is manifested by several cases in 1500 and 1501. Moreover, all masters of Jewish slaves were ordered to send them out of the country within 2 months, unless they would submit to baptism. Spain was too holy a land to be polluted with the presence of a Jew, even in captivity. In the absence of trustworthy statistics, all estimates of the number of victims must be more or less a matter of guesswork, and consequently they vary with the impressions or imagination of the annalist. Bernaldez informs us that Rabbi Meir wrote to Abraham Sr. that the sovereigns had banished 35,000 vassals, that is, 35,000 Jewish households, and he adds that of the 10 or 12 rabbis whom he baptized on their return, a very intelligent one named Zentoyo of Vitoria told him that there were in Castile more than 30,000 married Jews and 6,000 in the kingdoms of Aragon, making 160,000 souls when the edict was issued, which is probably as nearly correct an estimate as we can find. With time the figures grew. Albertino, Inquisitor of Valencia in 1534, quotes Reuchlin as computing the number of exiles at 420,000. The cautious Zurita quotes Bernaldez and adds that others put the total at 400,000, while Mariana tells us that most authors assert the number of households to have been 170,000, and some put the total at 800,000 souls. Paramo quotes the figures of 124,000 households, or over 600,000 souls. Isidore Loeb, after an exhaustive review of all authorities, Jewish and Christian, reaches the estimate: emigrants 165,000, baptized 50,000, died 20,000, total 235,000. And this, in view of the diminished number of Jews, as shown by the Repartimiento of 1474, is probably too large an estimate. Whatever may have been the number, the sum of human misery was incomputable. Rabbi Joseph, whose father was one of the exiles, eloquently describes the sufferings of his race. Quote, "For some of them the Turks killed to take out the gold which they had swallowed to hide it. Some of them hunger and the plague consumed, and some of them were cast naked by the captains on the isles of the sea, and some of them were sold for men servants and maid servants in Genoa and its villages, and some of them were cast into the sea, for there were among those who were cast into the isles of the sea upon Provence a Jew and his old father fainting from hunger, begging bread, for there was no one to break unto them in a strange country. And the man went and sold his son for bread to restore the soul of the old man. And it came to pass, when he returned to his old father, that he found him fallen down dead, and he rent his clothes. And he returned unto the baker to take his son, and the baker would not give him back, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry for his son, and there was none to deliver." Penniless, friendless, and despised, they were cast forth into a world which had been taught that to oppress them was a service to the Redeemer. Yet such were the convictions of the period in the 15th century, after Christ had died for man, that this crime against humanity met with nothing but applause among contemporaries. Men might admit that it was unwise from the point of view of statesmanship, and damaging to the prosperity of the land, but this only enhanced the credit due to the sovereigns whose piety was equal to the sacrifice. When, in 1495, Alexander VI granted to them the proud title of Catholic kings, the expulsion of the Jews was enumerated among the services to the faith entitling them to this distinction. Even so liberal and cultured a thinker as Gian Pico della Mirandola praises them for it, while he admits that even Christians were moved to pity by the calamities of the sufferers, nearly all of whom were consumed by shipwreck, pestilence, and hunger, rendering the destruction equal to that inflicted by Titus and Hadrian. It is true that Machiavelli, faithful to his general principles, seeks to find in Ferdinand's participation a political rather than a religious motive, but even he characterizes the act as a pietosa crudeltà. So far indeed was it from being a cruelty in the eyes of the theologians of the period, that Ferdinand was held to have exercised his power mercifully, for Arnaldo Albertino proved by the canon law that he would have been fully justified in putting them all to the sword and seizing their property. The edict of expulsion proclaimed to the world the policy which in its continuous development did so much for the abasement of Spain. At the same time it closed the career of avowed Jews in the Spanish dominions. Henceforth we shall meet with them as apostate Christians, the occasion and the victims of the Inquisition. End of Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 6.